Understanding History Through Questions presents World War II, a Case Study, European Theater Edition. The objectives of this video are to learn about the causes and effects of World War II, to think about the short-term and long-term consequences of World War II on its participants, see how the map of Europe changed before, during, and after the war, and to look at the war as more than just battles and dates, to take a look at it through the eyes of its participants. Our guiding questions are: how did World War I lead to World War II? What factors led up to the rise and fall of Hitler and the Third Reich? How do we reconcile free people being unwilling to accept responsibility for human atrocities in Nazi Germany? Does our freedom actually free us from responsibility for wartime atrocities? Is the so-called innocence of civilians a function of the type of government the civilians are living in, such as fascist, communist, or democratic? And does fear explain why there were so few who were willing to risk everything to save someone else, such as Karl Plagi or Oskar Schindler during World War II? How does art relate, if at all, to war, especially to World War II? And did the media create or make the heroes and villains, or did the person himself or herself set out to make a name for himself or herself? These two maps show how Europe looked before and after World War I. These territorial changes were the result of the Treaty of Versailles. Take a look at the area on the border of France and Germany. This is Alsace-Lorraine, and it was one of the territories that Germany wanted to reclaim after the war. World War I, Prelude to War. World War I and its aftermath played a pivotal role in creating the impetus for World War II, especially in Germany. The headline on the left is from the 11 November 1918 edition of the New York Times, and it reads, quote, "Armistice signed, end of the war, Berlin seized by revolutionists, new chancellor begs for order, ousted Kaiser flees to Holland," end quote. Germany was humiliated after its defeat in World War I. Its economy was in shambles, and the reparations proscribed in the Treaty of Versailles only exacerbated the problem. The caption of the photo on the right reads, quote, "Children playing with Deutsche Marks after the collapse of the German economy following World War I, 1923, end quote. The picture on the left depicts the Stahlhelm, German for steel helmets, which were one of the many paramilitary groups that formed after World War I. There were millions of unemployed, especially soldiers, because the German military was essentially disbanded as a condition of the armistice. German society at this time was very militaristic, and there was little distinction between political parties and paramilitary organizations. The rise of Hitler and the Third Reich. World War I and its aftermath was not the only factor that led to Hitler's rise to power. Hitler promised to restore Germany to her previous stature both economically and militarily. The picture on the right is from a 1930 Nazi propaganda poster before Hitler became chancellor. Hitler is pictured in uniform holding a Nazi flag with the words "Es lebe Deutschland," long live Germany, written underneath. The chart on the left shows the 6 stages of anti-Semitism. Stage 1 is ethnic anti-Semitism. This was practiced in ancient Greece and Rome. Stage 2 is Christian or religious anti-Semitism. This was practiced in antiquity and the Middle Ages, and unfortunately it continues until this day. Stage 3 is Muslim anti-Semitism, and it also was practiced during the Middle Ages, and it too unfortunately continues today. The reason why Christian religious and Muslim anti-Semitism comprise different stages is because Christianity existed before Islam. Stage 4 is political, social, and economic anti-Semitism. This stage happened during the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment, although one could argue that this stage began in antiquity when Jews were first subjected to pogroms and exile, and it continued off and on until World War II. Stage 5 is racial anti-Semitism, and it began during the Enlightenment and progressed to Nazism in the 20th century. Stage 6 is contemporary anti-Semitism, and it includes today's Israelophobia and Zionism equals racism. It is also political in nature. Notice how more than one stage can happen at the same time and in the same place. The stages are not necessarily chronological. For example, stages 2, 3, and 6 can exist in places with Muslims, Christians, and people who oppose Israel, who may come from the first two groups. Now, Hitler also seized upon latent prejudices, especially anti-Semitism. Historically, Europe scapegoated Jews during times of economic, political, or social upheaval, and the interwar years were no different. Remarkably, Hitler rose to power through legitimate means and shunned using force, albeit after force had initially failed. The picture on the left was taken right after Hitler became Chancellor in 1933. The above map shows Europe in 1940, after Hitler's invasion of Poland and the Anschluss of Austria. The fall of Hitler and the Third Reich.
Berlin's army school is the end of the road for the Nazi reign of terror. Here, Air Marshal Tedder, General Eisenhower's deputy, and Russia's Marshal Zhukov meet with Field Marshal Keitel, the haughty Prussian aristocrat and representative of the General Staff. This time, it's the German army that surrenders. No civilians are involved as in World War I. This time, the Wehrmacht takes its full share of blame for years of ruin and brutality. Keitel signs, marking the end of all German military action. Tedder and Zhukov add their signatures to the document that surrenders Germany to Allied control and completes Nazi humiliation. Following the ratification, the Allied officers tour the gutted Nazi capital. Berlin's once proud architecture is only a memory. Years of heavy pounding by the RAF and American air forces have made Germany's first city almost unlivable. Thousands of tons of bombs have pockmarked the famous Brandenburg Gate and laid waste the Hotel Adlon, former meeting place of world travelers. All Nazi government buildings have been destroyed, burying the infamous Hitler and Goebbels in their rubble. Berlin's history as one of the world's great capitals is ended. Not only her capital, but most of Germany's mighty industrial cities are wiped out. These first pictures of Hamburg, made by the RAF, reveal the indescribable destruction wrought by repeated air attacks on the Reich's second city. Once the largest seaport on the continent of Europe, Hamburg's docks along the River Elbe served the shipping of the world. Now, Hamburg is a ghost city. Only the outer walls of its thousands of buildings standing in mute testimony to the overwhelming power of Allied bombing. Bombing that tore the heart out of the Reich and buried tyranny in its ashes.
The preceding newsreel clip from May 17, 1945 shows footage of the Germans surrendering. 12 years after the rise of Hitler, Germany was right back where she had started, defeated and in shambles. Three main factors contributed to Hitler's defeat. 1. Indecisiveness on the battlefield. 2. Indecisiveness in setting objectives for the war effort at home. 3. Obsession with carrying out the final solution. The photo on the right shows the gate to the infamous Auschwitz death camp, where 1.1 million Jews and 200,000 others were murdered by the Nazis. The phrase on the gate says, Arbeit macht frei, German for work makes you free. It was a cynical slogan because before liberation, death was the only way out for most. The map on the left shows Hitler's ill-fated invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. Arguably, Hitler's greatest blunder was his fateful decision to invade the Soviet Union without planning for any contingencies. Hitler miscalculated the tenacity of the Red Army, and he also left his own troops at the mercy of the Russian winter. Unwillingness to accept responsibility. During the Nuremberg trials, the main excuse given by the Nazis for committing wartime atrocities was that they were just following orders, including the top leadership. All of the top Nazis blamed Hitler or other top leadership for their actions, with the notable exception of Hitler's Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer. Historians disagree over the sincerity of Speer's acceptance of responsibility. Some say he was truly sorry and fully accepted responsibility for his role, while others say he only did it to escape the handbank's noose, or life in prison. He's still ended up serving 20 years for his role. Freedom and responsibility. Pictured on the left is German Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant. According to Kant, Speer was the only rational being in the Nazi Party because he was the only one to admit responsibility. Morally speaking, freedom does not free us from responsibility for wartime atrocities. Kant believed that rational beings need to take responsibility for their actions. Thus, according to Kant, if our leaders are rational beings, then they must take responsibility for their wartime actions and suffer whatever consequences are meted out to them. The same rationale holds true for our enemies and all other participants in war. However, like the writing of history, war crimes tribunals are conducted by the victors, and the victors are not going to pursue and prosecute their own war criminals with the same zeal as they would enemy war criminals. The photo on the right shows the defendant's dock at Nuremberg. The art of war. Art was a big part of World War II. Art had many uses, such as recruiting and propaganda posters. Not only did the military employ combat photographers, but it also employed combat artists as well. The military was not the only enterprise to utilize combat artists. Companies such as Abbott Laboratories also employed combat artists. Robert Cromwell created this picture of an anti-aircraft crew in action in 1942. Heroes. The photo on the left depicts Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. 2 months later, FDR would die, and Truman, pictured on the right, would replace him. And villains. This photo is of Mussolini and Hitler around June 1940. Stalin, hero or villain? Joseph Stalin was a hero for crushing Nazi Germany, but he was also a villain for murdering millions of his own people. Despite his brutality, Stalin had a personality cult. However, he only embraced it after the war. The West either was unaware of Stalin's brutality or willfully ignored it until after the war ended. He was almost lovingly referred to as Uncle Joe in America until the Cold War. Then the name became pejorative. Shortly after Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet establishment officially denounced Stalin and Stalinism. Rommel, hero or villain? One of the heroes of World War II actually fought for the Germans. This hero is Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, also known as the Desert Fox of the German Wehrmacht. How can a soldier of the enemy's army be regarded as a hero? Was Rommel not responsible for many Allied casualties during the North African campaign? Rommel can be regarded as a hero because of how he carried himself and how he commanded his soldiers. Yes, he was responsible for many Allied casualties, but he always fought honorably. Rommel ignored or refused to follow any order to harm civilians or commit atrocities. He and his Afrika Korps never once committed a war crime. He was a soldier committed to defending his country, not fighting for Adolf Hitler and Nazism. Even the Allied commanders recognized his skill on the battlefield. Rommel was not a Nazi. He was essentially apolitical. In fact, he was a co-conspirator in Colonel Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg's failed plot to kill Hitler. He paid for his life for his part in the plot. The only reason Rommel was allowed to commit suicide instead of face execution was because Hitler recognized that he was so revered by the German people. Heroes and villains. Whether a figure is a hero or villain depends on who is rendering the judgment. It also depends on which actions of the individual in question are being judged. Some heroes and villains set out to make a name for themselves, and others choose to remain virtually unknown. Some heroes and villains were created or hyped by the media, and others' actions spoke for themselves. It is important to base judgments on historical evidence and any new evidence that may emerge. This evidence may include the person's words and deeds, their own oral or written accounts, and the oral or written accounts of their contemporaries, photos and film, and other historical sources. History is not set in stone. As more information becomes declassified and countries such as Germany and Russia release more documents to the public, our picture of World War II and its heroes and villains may change. The above map shows how Europe looked in 1945. The end of World War II once again redrew the map of Europe. This time, Germany was divided into East and West, and the territories that she took back in 1940 were returned. Germany would not be united again until 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down.